All right, good evening. Can you hear me? Sign of life from somebody, please. All right, fantastic. Cool. My name is Hunter, and I am a post-bac student studying pre-med. Oh, hang on. Let me get rid of this here. My name is Hunter, and this is week 5. We're doing respiration today for Principles of Biology students. Last week we covered circulation, and this is worth kind of circling back to and putting this in context. Circulation, we were talking about mostly blood, right? And moving blood and nutrients throughout the body, and nutrients out, waste products back in towards the... Whew! It's been a week, folks. Give me a second to reboot here. Circulation is important because we're talking about the transport of nutrients to the rest of the body and waste products out of the rest of the body. Respiration, we're going to get a little bit more into the minutia of that. This is a relatively short worksheet. If you have the worksheet, fantastic. If you don't, now is a good opportunity to download this week's and take a look at it. It's relatively short, so there's lots of opportunities here to jump in with questions. And with that, let's just dive right into the diagram here and start drawing things in. Let me rearrange my setup a little bit here. So respiration. How do we breathe? Why do we breathe? Who can tell me the difference? I'm going to keep talking, but in the chat, who can tell me the difference between ventilation and respiration? We touched on this last week, but let me see if you can remember. In the meantime, I'm going to start filling out this diagram here. We're going to go sequentially here and just fill out this diagram, and we'll start with the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is a bundle of musculature sort of under the rib cage here. I'm just going to draw it as this bundle under our lungs. But fairly straightforward. Diffusion we'll come back to, CO2 removal we'll come back to, O2 demand. Let's do, so alveoli. Alveoli are a component of the lungs, and this is the part that does gas exchange. This is where nutrients are really coming into the system here. They look like bundles of grapes. If you ever have an opportunity to see a dissection, it's pretty cool. So in the chat, we've got ventilation is the actual movement of air and respiration is the gas exchange in the lungs. Ding, 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 ding. Yeah. Respiration is entirely about gas exchange. Principally, we're looking at oxygen and CO2, which kind of set us up here for our diagram. This part we've probably heard before, right? We breathe in, oxygen comes in. We breathe out, CO2 goes out. CO2 is what plants are processing to make sugars, and is one of the principal components in our current climate crisis. So all of these systems are interconnected is the point of that. Okay. So let's go, we've got expired air. Air, of course, we'll go inspired. So the easy way to remember this is inspired. So we've got inspire. And then we'll do red for expire. So oxygen coming in with inspiration and CO going out with expiration. Order is important, right? Going back to circulation again, CO2 is one of the principal waste products that we're pulling out of our cells through the circulatory system. Expiration is how it gets out. So we've got O2 and CO2. So the air coming in through inspiration is highly saturated in O2. It saturates these alveoli, which, let's see if I've got another. Yeah, so we've got diffusion here. So this is a good opportunity to talk a little bit more about the alveoli, these bundles of grapes that are inside of our lungs, which is the site of gas exchange in the lungs. We inspire, oxygen-saturated air comes into the lungs and basically hangs out around these grapes. Now the shape of these grapes, these alveoli, is really important. The surface area is maximized, and there may actually be a question about this later. We can talk about it now, that's fine. The shape is maximized for the most surface area, so you have the most tissue, the most membrane in contact with that highly oxygenated air, so that gas can diffuse more rapidly throughout that breath. And I'm going to have to remember to take a breath here in between components here. So make a little note here. Gas diffusion. The other component that these alveoli have is that they are wrapped, basically, in vasculature, in capillaries. This vasculature is full of blood, which is where that oxygen needs to go. So oxygen touches the alveoli, which are wrapped up in this vasculature. Gas diffuses across those membranes into the vasculature, where it then goes to the heart. So like the lungs are part of the pulmonary circuit, pulmo prefix meaning lungs. So that deoxygenated blood pumps from the heart to the lungs, where it's wrapped around these alveoli. It gets heavily oxygenated. It goes back to the heart to wrap up that part of the pulmonary circuit, that part of the circulatory system, where it then gets pumped back out through the aorta and distributed around the rest of the body. So that's kind of the big picture here, tying these things together. And we have it. We've got our lungs, we've got our heart, we have oxygenated blood coming in, going to the lungs, and then oxygenated blood to the heart, and then out to the rest of the body. Just as a quick refresher. And today we're focusing on mostly this. So, lung tissue cells. I'm going to go ahead and do this in purple. We're just going to outline this. These, of course, are lungs. They're very flexible. Inflate and deflate with that change in pressure. And that movement is facilitated mostly by the diaphragm, but also by the intercostal muscle, skeletal muscle cells. And I'm just going to kind of do hash marks to represent the musculature of the rib cage, and then these muscles change the conformation of the chest, basically, to change the air pressure relative to the pressure outside our bodies, right? So I'm going to read this question really quick. So because the alveoli have all those bundles of capillaries, basically, that's how we're able to get blood oxygenated via the gas exchange. Correct. Yeah. So that vasculature being wrapped around the alveoli, which are that little grape shape, facilitates more rapid gas diffusion across those membranes because of the maximized surface area. And so that's kind of how the form of this part of the body facilitates the function of gas diffusion, of getting those nutrients in and waste products out. So deoxygenated blood is also circulating through there, and that CO2 is getting leached out of the vasculature into the lung space where it then gets expired, right? So yes, you're right on. Cool. So we're talking a little bit about lung cells and skeletal muscle cells. Let's talk about the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata is this most base part of the brain, which is descended from the hindbrain, right? This is the most ancient vertebral neural bundle, basically. Not a neurologist, don't quote me on that, but my memory of this, looking at the evolutionary perspective, is this was the part of the vertebrate brain that evolved first, and it controls all of these sort of involuntary functions of managing blood pH and things like that. So medulla oblongata somewhere around here, base of the skull, starting at the spine. In here we have these pH sensors, and that's what this. So it is the principal component contributing to the acidity of our blood. Our cells and the proteins that make them work denature outside of a very narrow pH range, right? It's around 7, and I don't remember if human pH was meant to be the sort of middle of the pH scale. I can't remember, but that's an easy way to remember it. 1 would be extremely acidic, and 14, I think, would be extremely basic. So humans are around 7.1, something like that. And it's a logarithmic scale, so the further away you get from that, the more orders of magnitude you have. The importance of the medulla oblongata in this whole system is, as it detects the change in pH in our blood, that prompts the musculature to contract or relax, which forces breathing, basically forces air into the lungs through negative pressure, and brings in that fresh oxygen. So we're going to get a little bit deeper into that in just a second, but medulla oblongata. So, and this is kind of where I think we're going with that CO2 demand, or O2 demand rather. Yeah. So by detecting the increased acidity of the blood, it's prompted to bring in more O2. And so some changes happen, which we're going to now discuss a little bit more. Does anyone have any other questions before we... So I've done a lot of talking, and now we get to dig into the questions. Why O2 is brought in to make something less acidic. Yes, and we're going to get to talk about that in a little more resolution now that I've done this like 15-minute preamble with the visuals. Now we get into the questions themselves. So explain briefly why we breathe, or more specifically, where is what we breathe in used in the body, and where is what we breathe out produced in the body. So again, we breathe in to supply our cells with the oxygen that they need to use in cellular respiration. So this is tied to metabolism, keep that in the back of your mind. Specifically, as it's the ultimate electron acceptor in the electron transport chain of oxidative phosphorylation. So phosphorylation again being related to ATP. We're looking up here. This diagram in mind, or visible, I guess, while we're talking about this. So we take in glucose through the food that we eat. Oxygen comes in through respiration or through ventilation. Cellular respiration occurs, and CO2 is the necessary byproduct of that cellular respiration, of that breakdown of glucose. Our other byproducts being water, and then ATP, which is the energy source that is actually accessible to our cells. So in brief, I'm going to go ahead and type this. We breathe in. Oh, what's happened? That's not what I wanted to do. Sorry guys, every once in a while the technology kind of does something unexpected. So, Control-All, please. Wow, I've reset the thing. Okay. Give me 1 second. Not going to happen. All right. We're going to roll with it. Set picture as background. Now it doesn't move as much. Sorry. All right, we'll write it off to the side. Maybe. There we go. We breathe in to support ourselves with the oxygen, for use in cellular respiration. Specifically, it's the ultimate electron acceptor. Yep. In the electron transport chain, also known as oxidative phosphorylation. We breathe out to rid our bodies of carbon dioxide, CO2, which is a waste product, cellular respiration. The sugars, this is important. The sugars that undergo cellular respiration are broken down to CO2 and water. Cool. Six moles of O2 comes into the cell through cellular respiration. CO2 is sent out. Is the cellular respiration happening throughout the entire body, or do the cells in the alveoli have special lung cells that make them perform cellular respiration more? No. So the alveoli are just structured to facilitate that gas diffusion. Cellular respiration happens at every level of the organism, right? So that will change based on the type of cell that it is and its energy demands. For example, muscle cells have a much greater metabolic demand than probably those alveoli, if I had to guess. But yeah, I hope that answers your question. All right, question 2. So oxygen is transported in the blood in reversible combination with hemoglobin. How does the level of carbon dioxide in the blood contribute to blood pH? And write the chemical equation. So we were kind of alluding to this when... All right, let's write the chemical reaction. H2O were our byproducts. You may remember from Gen Chem, if you guys are in that, this process was described in detail, or may have been described in detail, talking about the acidification of reefs. It's the exact same process, and it has to do with carbonic acid. H2CO3. I'm just acid. Those free protons in solution increase the acidity of the solution, bring down the pH, and it's bad for proteins, is all I can say. So in other words, the higher the carbon dioxide concentration in the blood, the higher the available hydrogen ion concentration in the blood, which makes it very, very acidic. This is also the reason that carbonated beverages are more acidic than non-carbonated ones. Part B, how does the level of CO2 in the blood affect the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen? That is, how does the concentration of CO2 in the blood change its ability to carry oxygen, the effect of the Bohr shift, and what is the Bohr shift? Does the level of CO2 in the blood affect the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen? So hemoglobin's job is transporting oxygen around the body, right? So if there's a high concentration of CO2, what we can infer from this is either not enough oxygen's coming in and cellular respiration is occurring in a deficit of oxygen, or metabolism is increased relative to the amount of oxygen coming in. So this one's kind of straightforward in that, yeah. So having made those assumptions then, we could say that the conformation or the shape of hemoglobin molecules must change in response to the pH, the acidity of the blood. So let's go ahead and write that down. The conformation, where are we? All right. We're sticking with the pen today. Hemoglobin is so at lower physiological pHs, this shape change causes hemoglobin to give up more of its oxygen at a given partial pressure than it would at a higher physiological pH. So it's as the metabolic demands of the cells increase, hemoglobin is more likely to give up the oxygen that it's transporting. So its affinity for oxygen decreases. So shape change, I'm just going to abbreviate here. Let's see. We'll say give up more of its oxygen. Given pressure. Does that make sense? So metabolic need for oxygen increases. Hemoglobin changes its shape in response to that increased acidity so that it holds onto the oxygen less tightly, makes that oxygen more available for the cells to use for more cellular respiration. So is the Bohr shift more likely to occur after exercise or after hyperventilation, or after breathing with no exercise involved? And explain. Do we have any guesses here? Straightforwardly, like exercise increases metabolism increases the energy demand of the body. Would hyperventilation do the same? Is the bore shift more likely to occur after exercise or after hyperventilation, that is, rapid breathing with no exercise involved? Exercise increases the amount of ATP required per unit time compared to no exercise. That's another way of saying increased metabolic demands. ATP production via cellular respiration produces carbon dioxide as a waste product, and the addition of more carbon dioxide lowers the pH in the tissue. And that resulting conformational change in the hemoglobin delivers more oxygen to tissues undergoing exercise than to other tissues. I don't think, oh my goodness, there's stuff happening in the chat that I couldn't see. I'm sorry. Bore shift is about shifting the oxygen equilibrium in response to CO2. You are correct. Yes, so hyperventilation would just be flooding the body with O2 that it doesn't need. Not necessarily. It could also, kind of in the same way we were talking about circulation last week, where if the timing of the pulses of the heart don't allow for those chambers to fill all of the way, then it can't effectively transport blood where it needs to go, and it can't transport waste products back out. Similarly here, it's not just that we're bringing in more oxygen than we need, and the partial pressure difference across those membranes isn't significant enough that diffusion will happen. We're also not giving it effective time to transport oxygen in and waste products out. So you can still end up with mild acidosis from hyperventilating. There is a question about this later too. We'll get to kind of demonstrate this in a way many of you have experienced. Okay, so exercise. Increases demand for to product, and in chain hemoglobin oxygen to cells. And now we're actually talk more about this relationship. So compare the oxygen dissociation curves for hemoglobin. So down here we have PO2, that's partial pressure of oxygen, in millimeters of mercury. If you've ever taken somebody's blood pressure or had your blood pressure taken with the cuff that wraps around your arm, millimeters of mercury is sort of an antiquated unit of measure, but that's what that unit is, with a normal blood pressure being around 20 systolic, 80 diastolic, which that would have been a more helpful factoid in the circulation unit, but here we are. So, compare the oxygen dissociation curves for hemoglobin. How do the curves differ? Whoever made these curves kind of helped us out by making sure that this dotted line corresponds to here, so you can see the difference a little bit more readily. The difference here, we have oxygen saturation of hemoglobin in percentage on the left, or on the y-axis rather, and the x-axis is our partial pressure of oxygen. So on the right, in reduced conditions, this is maybe just a good stopping point actually. A lot of folks, me included, have a hard time reading these charts sometimes, and so it's just a good practice to be in to kind of orient yourself before you really dive into your analysis, right? So we have a couple of titles. I'm going to highlight these in blue. We have normal adult, reduced pH conditions, and fetal versus adult. We have our curves. We have our x-axis, which is uniform across them. It's the partial pressure of oxygen in millimeters of mercury. And then we have, and our y-axis remains the same. O2 saturation of hemoglobin, yes. I'm calculating this by benefit because sometimes my brain just turns letters and numbers into gibberish, and it doesn't make any sense. So this is a practice that helps me sometimes when I have the benefit of highlighters and multicolored pens, or a tablet in this case. Then we can kind of start to talk about the differences. So now that we've oriented ourselves, we know which chart is which, we know what units we're comparing, now we can start to compare them. So we have our dotted line for the chart on the left, so we can compare just by looking at the chart on the left. So this is the one that we're interested in. And the only difference here is the reduced pH environment. So we've reduced the pH, meaning we've increased the acidity. Right? Lower number means increased acidity. And we can see that the partial pressure of oxygen has increased. There's a shift to the right relative to the chart on the left, given the same percentage of oxygen saturation in the blood. So this is another way of visualizing. We've been exercising, the metabolic needs have gone up, we're processing a lot of ATP, turning it into usable energy, and we're getting all of that CO2 byproduct and it's in the blood. That drops the pH of the blood. Hemoglobin changes conformation, releases oxygen, so we have an increased partial pressure of oxygen in the blood at the same percentage of oxygen saturation. Cool. So that's the top one. Then we have fetal versus adult. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let's go ahead and write some of that. Normal versus reduced pH. Reduced pH equals increased partial pressure. It really can be that simple. And we can leave it there. Due to cellular respiration. Leave it there. So let's take a look here. So our dark line is the mother, is the adult, and the gray line is our fetus. So infant, I guess. So the adult hemoglobin here is becoming completely saturated with oxygen. That is, it's carrying as much as it can at a partial pressure of approximately 100 millimeters of mercury. We're kind of extrapolating what that curve is going to look like. So it's reached saturation at 100 millimeters of mercury. By contrast, it's also worth noting that 100 millimeters of mercury is the approximately the partial pressure of oxygen in the human lung. By contrast, the fetal hemoglobin becomes saturated at about 60 millimeters of mercury. So this would allow the fetus to pull more oxygen from the mother's blood than it could if the fetus had the same type of hemoglobin. So yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. So, saturated at the adult. puppy in the background. More oxygen from the head. Hemoglobin. For those of you interested in healthcare at all, this is one of the reasons that pediatric medicine is so challenging, is because their physiology is changing day by day and then week by week for many years. Oh gosh, sorry about that, guys. Yeah, I have a little, she's a blue heeler Chihuahua mix, and she's a little territorial. She likes to bark at everything. But fortunately we live in kind of an isolated spot, so it's not generally too much of a problem. But she lets us know every time that the male person comes. All right. It's part B. What would happen if fetal and adult hemoglobin had the same affinities for oxygen? So a moment ago we said that the fetal hemoglobin reaches saturation at a lower partial pressure of oxygen. What would happen if they reached saturation at the same? Or, no, that's not what they're asking. They're asking if fetal and adult hemoglobin had the same affinities for oxygen. So oxygenated, let's oh, we have an answer here. Fetus wouldn't be able to get oxygen as easily. I think you're on the right track. Can you tell me a little bit more about why? And in the meantime, I'm gonna go back to this conversation of circulation a little bit. So oxygenated blood from the mother's left ventricle, right, passes through the other tissues before it reaches the placenta, right? So as a result, the partial pressure of oxygen in that mother's blood is going to be less than 100. Right? So if the hemoglobin of the mother and the fetus had the same affinities for oxygen, but the blood getting to the fetus is never at 100, basically our fetal cells are never going to get the oxygen that they need. So it's not just about getting oxygen as easily; it's never reaching saturation. Our fetus would be hypoxic 100% of the time. Hypoxic, hypo. Oxygenation. There'd be no incentive for the O2 to leave the mom's blood for the fetus. You are correct. That's exactly it. So, O2 levels from mom's blood is below 100, below a partial pressure of 100 millimeters of mercury. By the time it reaches the placenta, which is the organ supplying all of the vasculature and nutrients from the mother to the fetus. So if fetal hemoglobin and adult hemoglobin to affinity would remain which would probably affect development. If they don't get want, some small children threaten to hold their breath until they die. Children who are very strong-willed may turn blue, but they will not die because they will pass out and the autonomic breathing process will take over. What types of control are involved in holding your breath? Why, for what physiological reason, will you pass out if you hold your breath for too long? I love this question so much. My brother was very adept at making himself pass out when he was a tiny person. A little bit last week about what happens when there isn't enough oxygen in your blood, and actually this is related to the way that things like heart rate monitors measure the oxygen saturation in your blood, measure heartbeat to heartbeat even. And sometimes it's as simple as shooting a white or a green light at your skin and measuring the amount of red, measuring the amount of red in your skin, because it changes heartbeat to heartbeat even and breath to breath. And that's how these devices are measuring those vitals. So we've got some action in the chat here. Let's see. I would assume that the medulla is in control, and probably the reason you pass out is because of the lack of O2 to the brain. In a word, yes. We hold our breath. There's no O2 coming in. CO2 builds up. There's that increased acidity in the blood, right? And at some point, yes, there's a trigger where the brain goes, whatever's happening can't continue. We need oxygen. And then it causes that sort of autonomic takeover. So if we can rewind a little bit, look back at your diagrams that we were drawing earlier, and the first thing we drew in there was the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is really, really cool because it's sort of a mystery in terms of the conscious and unconscious controls of the diaphragm. If I think about it, I can hold my breath and exhale when I want to. But it'll also happen unconsciously, like when we're sleeping. And there's obviously like some kind of evolutionary reflex built in here where if I'm consciously holding my breath for long enough that it starts to cause problems, my brain will say, yeah, you're done. And we get that autonomic override. That was a lot of talking. Let me make sure I'm hitting on all the points here. So in both cases, holding your breath and hyperventilating, carbon dioxide level in your blood changes. Changes in blood pH, carbon dioxide levels, are sensed in the medulla of the brain. If carbon dioxide levels get too high, the medulla triggers a nervous response that causes you to pass out. It's a both and proposition. So the diaphragm is really, really, really exciting from that perspective. Okay, so if the carbon dioxide level gets too high, the medulla triggers a nervous response that causes you to pass out. The medulla's involuntary control of the rate of breathing is then restored. When you hyperventilate, you reduce the carbon dioxide level in the blood and therefore increase the blood pH. And this is generally recognized by the medulla, and involuntary breathing is reduced or stops. If you continue to force hyperventilation, going back to what we were talking about earlier, again, you can reduce the carbon dioxide level so much, or conversely increase the oxygen level so much, that it causes the peripheral arteries to constrict. And this reduces blood flow to the brain and other parts of the body, causing you to pass out. So you have this kind of seesaw mechanism. I'm going to go ahead and draw this. CO2 load increases. This way, we would have a lower O2 level. If O2 box increases, we would have, well, depending on which side of our seesaw is going up and down. No problem. Thanks for sticking around. Hopefully you guys already know these sessions are recorded and do get posted to the Learning Center's YouTube for viewing later. I know they don't stay on Twitch forever, and so if you aren't able to attend the live session, that's fine. Do make sure that you put a good faith effort in on the worksheet and submit whatever you've got to the, I think it's a Google Drive folder for you guys. There's a form submission. Make sure you do that. I understand that there's extra credit at stake. I'm just grading for completion just to see that you put an effort in. So, yeah. Let's see. Oh, we're doing good on time. Okay. So, I've drawn my little seesaw and now we haven't written anything about that reflex. But this is kind of our last, this is our last question. So we have a little bit of time. I'm happy to talk about whatever you guys want to talk about. If you have questions about respiration, questions about circulation, studying in general, we can do that. So I will hang out for the remaining 12 minutes. Let me know what you guys want to cover. And I'm just going to finish writing my last little bit here. Oh no. Oh no. If anybody can still hear me, it seems my computer has reached its threshold and is not responding. So I'm going to try to relaunch here. Unfortunately, I can't see